Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Heritage Llangwm podcast. I'm Heather Payton. This past month, the work on the church has really taken off. The floor's been removed and contractors have surveyed what may or may not be underneath with ground-penetrating radar. But sadly, a tight schedule dictated that the very next day, the whole lot was covered with concrete. Higher up, the builders have been working on the roof, but here at ground level, we Heritage Llangwm labourers have been continuing our efforts to find out more about our village's 12th century Flemish founders. In this episode, we'll be hearing what happens when historians disagree.
There are sort of inconsistencies in the account itself, and we can only guess why that's so. Perhaps we shouldn't take it too literally or too seriously.
And what we may find, if we're lucky, underneath the effigies.
So if this is a funeral burial practice of the time, you never know.
What can she be talking about? We'll find out later. There's a saying about economists attributed to Churchill that if you put two of them in a room, you'll get two opposing opinions. Would he have said the same about historians researching Flemish emigration? Well, documents we've studied suggest the Flemings fled to Britain, having been driven from their homes by flooding. Certainly the most picturesque scenario. But were they? Jan Dumoulin is a professor of history at Ghent University in Belgium, and he should know. So I put that theory to him over a rather dodgy Skype line.
No, that's nonsense, I think. There is not one big flood in Flemish history. When you look at the coastal area of Flanders, it has been under the influence of the sea, of tidal movements, the local communities, as well as the Count of Flanders. They gradually transformed the landscape, as happened in Holland as well, for instance, reclaiming land from the sea. And so flooding was a constant threat, of course. This would not cause people to move somewhere else.
Oh well, Jan Dumoulin battling through the ether. He went on to say the idea may have arisen because Flemings were good at flood protection, so would have been welcome as immigrants. So were they driven out by flooding or not? Another eminent prof, Hugh Price in Bangor, having consulted the ancient Brita Tuasogion, or Chronicle of the Princes, has come up with a different interpretation.
It starts by saying that these Flemings had been hidden away for a long time in Britain, that they were already there. But then it goes on to suggest that they'd come straight over from Flanders following flooding and inundation of the land. So there are sort of inconsistencies in the account itself, and we can only guess why that's so. One suggestion is that the mention of flooding was more a kind of literary device, that the author's perhaps aware that floodings occurred in Flanders at times, and this seemed a way of explaining why the Flemish had come over to Britain at least, if not directly to Pembrokeshire. So because it doesn't tally very closely with known important inundations in Flanders, that could be an explanation for the reference here, and so perhaps we shouldn't take it too literally or too seriously.
Professor Hugh Price in Bangor. So let's bring this closer to home and find out where these ideas come from and how likely they are to be true. Simon Hancock is curator of Haverfordwest Town Museum. So why did the Flemings come to Pembrokeshire?
According to the chronicles, there are several different reasons ascribed to why the Flemings came to southwest Wales. William of Malmesbury, for example, he mentions how they were basically taken to Pembrokeshire by Henry I from other parts of England, perhaps the lowlands of Scotland, as a useful buffer against the Welsh to rein them in. So that's William of Malmesbury, who was a remarkably well-informed man. But then, if you look back then at the Chronicle of the Princes, which is the most important medieval document for the study of history, Welsh history. Probably it was Welsh copies of the Latin original. That mentions about the storm surge which flooded the Netherlands, well, the Low Countries, in October 1134. So the chroniclers aren't united in terms of giving a reason why the Flemings arrived, but it could well be both are right, because of course there wasn't just one wave of Flemish migration, there were several, and so one was talking of one and the other source is talking of the later arrival in 1134, which a climactic freak event caused them to leave their homeland.
What about before 1066? Because some historians talk about what might almost amount to an economic area of the North Sea, with a great fluidity of movement of people and, of course, trade.
I think sometimes it's difficult to really understand the past, because everyone who looks at the past does so from the viewpoint of our own education. But if you go back to the Norman, pre-Norman times, then clearly the consciousness of being national, nation states, people didn't think that way. And so I think the past was far more fluid, far more ill-defined, and far more cosmopolitan than we would ever imagine. For example, in early Haverfordwest, we've got documents relating to English, Norman. You've got Norse traders from Dublin, money-lending Jews. You've got merchants from France. There were even merchants trading to the Balearic Islands. And so this is and Haverfordwest, when it was a major port, was part of the Sevenside economic area. So I think, looking at that, it's probably a very plausible argument to see commerce, trade in its wider sense.
Well, you think about today's immigrants and immigration in general, and if you have the right sort of skills, you will be in demand. And it sounds as though the Flemings, they were plainly very good at things involving land drainage and land use and weaving and spinning and this sort of thing. Would they have been very desirable immigrants?
Well, I think they were a set of immigrants who had a wide number of things going for them. We know from Gerald that they were very skilled warriors, and you've got Flemish mercenaries in many of the armies of the English kings. In fact, there was a contract between the early Norman kings and the Count of Flanders, where the Count of Flanders received £500 in English money in return for a certain number of foot soldiers and cavalry. And even people like King John, who came to Haverfordwest in 1210, had Flemish mercenaries with him. So the Flemish were mercenaries in the early Middle Ages, like the Swiss were mercenaries later on in the 16th century. So they were very skilled in terms of warfare, tenacious fighters, but they were also very commercially adept. And of course the woolen trade was the backbone of prosperity in the Middle Ages for Wales and also for England, and of course they would have been absolutely had the right skills to develop and grow the woolen industry.
In some parts of the UK, I believe in London, and I think in Colchester, there was a lot of violence, pogroms almost, if you like, against Flemish, because of simply the idea that they were taking people's jobs. How easily did they fit into the community here? Was there that sort of problem, or did they get along well? Were they good immigrants?
Well, unfortunately, all we really know from the surviving documents, which are basically property documents, is the sheer veracity of different groups. For example, there's a wonderful document in the 13th century which talks of Hugh the Fleming and Mabel his wife. So clearly this person is distinctive because they said he was the Fleming. So clearly there's something distinctive in a different document. Then in 1410 there's Thomas the Welshman, and I think that one is even more interesting because Thomas the Welshman, this is Wales, so being the Welshman, he must have been not the odd one out, but he must have been pretty distinctive for being Welsh. So I think we've got a really cosmopolitan community, or communities in South Pembrokeshire. And if you look through all the property deeds which have survived in Haverfordwest, and it's probably got the best surviving town deeds in Wales, you've got people with wonderful names like Perkin Graciot and wonderful continental names.
So it sounds as though the community here in Pembrokeshire benefited from the Flemings.
I think like any other wave of immigration, and of course today migration, immigration, economic migrants is a very contentious political discourse, especially as we come up now to this referendum on the EU membership. But I think migration has enriched society. It's broadened horizons, it's brought in new people, made you think. It challenges people not to be insular, and I'm pretty sure that they enriched the society into which they arrived.
Simon Hancock, curator of Haverfordwest Town Museum, on conflicting ideas about our Flemish immigrants. Another part of our research concerns the two effigies in the church due to be removed and conserved, then replaced on a damp-proof plinth. As you may know, they represent a man and a woman of differing dates, But the awful thing is we don't even know who they are. Dr. Rhiannodd Pibroch is a medieval historian and expert on commemorative monuments, and she told me first about effigies in general.
They have lots and lots of functions. Primarily, they have a spiritual function. People in those days, of course, believed in purgatory, the belief that after death your soul did not go straight to heaven or to hell, but it lingered in this limbo place, purgatory. And what happened to it there was that it was purged of its sins, and of course, depending on how sinful you'd been and also how much you'd atoned for those sins in life, you could actually be immersed in purgatory for many thousands of years, it was thought. And so it was incredibly important to medieval people that that time in purgatory was shortened, if at all possible. And having a memorial effigy was one way in which you could do this.
So was it the person it was a memorial to? Was he or she the person who'd be saved, or was it their relative who paid for it, presumably?
Well, that's a good question. It's primarily intended to save or to decrease the amount of time in purgatory for the person who it commemorates. But again, the act of commissioning such a tomb is good for your own soul.
Is it also to do with showing off your wealth, like of course a lot of art has been?
Definitely. You could have the same effect of prompting prayers just by having a very simple plain cross slab, for example, and there are fragments of 2 or 3 of those in Llangwm Church. But they, of course, are much less eye-catching and are cheaper products as well to produce and to commission, and therefore they don't say so much about your status. And of course, what an effigy does, especially an effigy like these two, where you have them lifted up from the floor on elaborately carved tomb chests and surmounted by elaborately carved canopies as well, you really are showing off your status and your wealth.
Were they supposed to look like the person? Because one of the things, if you're going to be a bit mean, I suppose, that you could say about our male effigy is he's got rather short legs, hasn't he?
He has got rather short legs, yes. I think that might have been a quirk of the craftsman who made it. In terms of actual portraiture, no. There was no suggestion that it had to look anything like the person. Personal sort of facial characteristics weren't important as far as the primary function of the tomb was concerned, which was, i.e., the salvation of the soul. Generally, when you look at effigies from this period, they look kind of, you would say youthful adults, I would suppose, in their 30s. You don't see lines or wrinkles or sagging skin or anything like that. And that's not necessarily because they died young. Historians tend to think of this as being because what you're trying to do, of course, is to encourage the resurrection of the soul. And therefore, effigies are depicted, or the people who are commemorated by the effigies are depicted as having died in their early 30s, at the same age as Jesus died, so 32 or 33, and that is regarded as being the perfect spiritual age. It was far more important to have the person represented according to their correct social status.
So what about our effigies? I mean, what can you tell us, first of all, about the dates?
Well, they don't go together in terms of their dates. They could well be, a mother and son. I could accept a mother and son, or certainly 2 different generations. So the female effigy, the lady, even though she's very, very worn, it's likely that she is anywhere from the late 13th to the early 14th century. So let's say roughly about 1300. And there are various pointers to that date. There are things like the clothes that she wears, which are very long and quite loose-fitting. Most of it, as I've said, is covered up by this sort of very voluminous mantle that she wears, but she doesn't have any fashionable items which would point to her coming from a period much later than about 1320.
Well, what about the man?
Well, our man, our knight, is very characteristic. His armour can be compared to other effigies which we know the date of, which come from the 1340s. He also has his legs crossed, which is a feature which stops quite suddenly at around 1350.
There was a belief that the crossed legs denoted the fact that he was a crusader.
Yes, you often hear this. Sometimes when I'm in cathedrals and things doing my research, and a guide and a party of tourists will come along and they'll point out the cross legs, and the guide invariably says, "Oh, this means he was a crusader." And I've even heard somebody say that depending on whereabouts the legs are crossed, how high up the leg or how low down, if they crossed at the ankle or at the thigh or something, that denotes how many crusades they went on. And you know, for want of a better word, that's total nonsense.
He has a sword, of course. What does that mean?
Well, he was a military man, and you'd expect him to have a sword. And the whole point of him being in armour could mean several things. It could mean that he was actually a knight, in the sense that he had been dubbed and he was Sir So-and-so de la Roche. What it definitely represents is the fact that he was the lord of the local society. He was the top dog in local society.
Ours have been pretty badly afflicted by damp, and there is a plan to lift them out and to put some sort of waterproof layer back on the plinth before they're returned. Is that going to work? I mean, are they really pretty hardy things?
Well, they're not as hardy as you'd think. But yes, it is important to make an effort to conserve them if at all possible. And of course, the really good thing about when these conservation takes place is that the monuments will be taken apart. The effigies will hopefully be lifted off. The chest will be dismantled, and you can find out an awful lot more about how they are manufactured.
Would there be anything we might turn up that might give us a clue as to who it is?
Of course, the ultimate thing would be to find the body. And I mean, when I was doing my PhD research, everything I always read suggested to me that inside the tomb chest, all you're expected to find is rubble, to strengthen the structure, and that the body itself will be in the ground below, or maybe just somewhere near in the chapel or in the vicinity underground. But the tomb of Blanche Mortimer in Muchmarkel in Herefordshire was conserved recently at great expense, and when they took her tomb chest apart, they found her in a lead coffin inside the tomb chest, which is very, very unexpected. So who knows what you might find? I mean, Blanche Mortimer was buried at around the same time that this knight would have been buried in the 1340s. So if this is a funeral burial practice of the time, you never know.
Goodness me. Dr. Rhiannoth Beebrock will be advising on the conservation of our effigies. Well, that's it for now. Don't forget, for those of you who volunteered, the archaeological dig at Great Nash Farm takes place during the last 3 weeks of April, when we hope to find more reminders of Llangwm's Flemish ancestors. As always, huge thanks to the people whose support makes the Heritage Llangwm project possible, the Heritage Lottery Fund. Until next time, thanks for listening.